Hi, this is Misha, and this video is on the Springfield 1903 and the 1903A3. Here we go. But before we can really talk about this rifle, we should talk about what came before it. The U.S. military's first rifle firing a smokeless powder cartridge was the 1892 Craig Jorgensen, which was also made by Springfield. This replaced the older single-shot black powder Springfield 1873 trapdoor, and a trial was held in 1892 at Governor's Island. Several people were brought in fact pretty much all the who's who of the day of arms designers, but in the end a Norwegian design by Mr. Craig and Mr. Jorgensen was selected to become America's first smokeless powder rifle. It fired the .30 caliber Army round, often called 30-40 Craig. The 40 is kind of a holdover from the grains day of the old black powder. It was adopted as the 1892. However, it did not go into production and did not start to be issued until 1894. Springfield had to set up its production line, so on and so forth. Now, what I'm holding here is actually a model 1896. Very, very similar to the 1892, with just a few differences. For one, the original 1892 had a cleaning rod under the barrel, a steel cleaning rod. The 1896 moved that to a trapdoor in the butt plate. Also, the 1896 had a strengthened buttstock and a redesigned, stronger rear sight assembly. But minor differences, you get the idea. Both the 1892 and 1896 were made in two versions, as an infantry rifle with a 30-inch barrel like this one here, and as a so-called cavalry carbine with a 22-inch barrel, although really by the standards of the day, 22 inches was an awfully long length for a carbine. Most carbines then had an 18 or 19-inch barrel, but you get the idea. They were concerned about accuracy. This gun is mechanically quite unique. We have a turned down, well, not really turned down, but an angled down bolt handle, which is pretty good for that era. We have an exposed cocking piece here, which is nice. If you didn't have an ignition, you could try again, or if you had it cocked and needed to let off, you could ease it forward pretty reliably. This is checkered and very easy to grasp. This bolt has a single locking lug, which, while it doesn't make it very strong in the grand scheme of things, does make it very smooth. And finally, we have a 5-round magazine, which feeds from the side, and it's kind of a half circle. It's a rotary magazine. Pretty unique for military guns. Other than that, it's a pretty standard rifle as we'd know it today. Straight stock, sling swivels. We have a stacking swivel in the front, bayonet lug. Typical front sight of the day. Very finely adjustable rear sight here. You just screw it back down when you have it the height you want. Short upper handguard, again very typical for the day. Nice triggers on these. One other feature, we have a magazine feed cutoff here. Toggle it on and off. So you could either single shot or feed from the magazine. And that was pretty much the U.S. Springfield Craig. The 1896 model would be replaced by the 1898 model, which was really a streamlined version for mass production. They did change the rear sight again, and they made a few different changes to make it faster, cheaper to produce. These would be in service in time for the Spanish-American War and would be used most famously up against Spain's 1893 Mauser in 7mm. They would keep these in production until about 1904, and they would produce about 500,000. Now that was for the Army. The U.S. Navy took a different route, and we already have a full video on this gun, so I'm not trying to give it short shrift, but if you're interested in further details, check that video out. But I wanted to mention it here just for completeness' sake. This is the Winchester 1895 so-called Lee Navy. The Army went with the Craig. The Navy was not happy with it, so in 1894 they held their own round of trials at the torpedo station. And the two best contenders were a design from Luger and a design from James Paris Lee. Well, the Luger fell out and the James Paris Lee design was adopted and became the 1895. The first contract was issued to Winchester for 10,000 rifles in 1896, but it wasn't until the following year that they started to deliver guns because of having to set up the production line. Also, the Navy kept changing its mind about the ammunition. Uniquely, this fired a 6mm round, which is a very small diameter for the era, and was a very high velocity round for the era. So it took a little doing to get it to go. This is a unique, almost straight pull action. It's not quite a straight pull, but you get the idea. It's got a bolt release over here. Nice triggers on these. It feeds from a vertical 5-shot mag. It's interesting. These can be loaded either with packets or single shot. It'll eject the packet out the bottom, not dissimilar to a Mannlicher. We still have a finely adjustable rear sight, but it's not near as convoluted as the one on the Craig. It actually has a spring-loaded catch versus the little wheel. We have a 28-inch barrel. Still a bayonet lug, still a stacking. It is a unique gun. Again, check out the video we have on it. But the Navy would first purchase 10,000 of these, and then they would purchase about 5,000 more in 1898. By the end of that year, the naval contract was over, so they had fewer than 15,000 total, really. The Marines would also use these. Now, both these guns would be used, both the Craig and the Lee Navy would be used in the Spanish-American War, and a short time later, the Philippine Uprising. And that's where shortcomings of both were quickly illustrated. The Lee Navy, it was really ahead of its time. The cartridge was too hot, it burned barrels out, the action is kind of different. It just didn't work out, unfortunately. It wasn't durable enough, it just didn't work out. The Craig, on the other hand, going up against Mausers, it wasn't strong enough, and it didn't have the range. The 30 caliber cartridge it fired was considerably weaker than the Mauser cartridge, and it could not be topped off by stripper clips like the Mauser was able to be. You actually had to single feed it. So what are they going to do? You know, they just adopted both of these guns. The Lee Navy not so much invested in, but the Craig, this was the standard issue. Well, at the Springfield Arsenal, they took several captured Spanish Mausers and began working on them. And they came up with the Model 1900 prototype, which was what would lead to this gun here. The 1900 prototype was essentially a reverse-engineered 1893 Mauser with some of the elements from the Craig thrown in. It would fire what would become the 30-03 cartridge, which, while it was touted as being a higher velocity, longer range, more accurate version of the 30 caliber Army or 30-40 Craig, it was still a round-nosed bullet. They would continue work, and then there would be the 1902 prototype, and at this time they would make the decision on the barrel. Instead of doing a carbine and infantry rifle as with the Craig, they would do a one-size-fits-all short rifle with a 24-inch barrel. This would become the 1903 Springfield, and it would officially be adopted in 1905, again firing 30-03, round-nosed bullet. It would have the cocking piece of the Craig. It would have a magazine feed cutoff, not too dissimilar from the Craig. But it would have a Mauser-style bolt system with two lugs. The one thing they did, they used the turn-down bolt, again, sort of from the Craig. And then the integral 5-round magazine, double stack, double feed, flush fit with their movable base plate from the Mauser. Right when this was being adopted, though, is when the Spitzer cartridge, the pointed cartridge, was coming into vogue in Europe. So they went back to the drawing board and they turned the 30-03 cartridge into what we know today as the 30-06. It was a Spitzer version, a pointed version, which achieved much better velocity, range, accuracy. It was just all around a better round. They also, the earliest guns, used a rod bayonet, which was worthless. They went to a standard blade bayonet, and then they had to change the rear sight to work with the new cartridge, and they updated it. This is, again, the adjustment is very similar to the Craig. Unscrew this, slide it up, and then screw it back down to lock it in. Kind of a silly thing, if you ask me, to have to be screwing and unscrewing in combat. It also has windage adjustment here. You turn the screw to drift the whole base side to side. We've got a handguard in front of it, pretty full length. Front sight, pretty standard bayonet lug. Again, in a lot of ways, it's a very standard gun. A straight stock, very much like the Craig, and a storage compartment in the butt plate, very much like a Craig, for cleaning utensils. By 1906, these would be ready to go, and they would go into production not only at the Springfield Arsenal, but also Rock Island Arsenal. The Craig would be out of production in 1904, as I said, and it would begin to be replaced by this model here, the 1903, around 1907, 1908. By World War I, Craigs were still in inventory in the U.S. military, but they were used by second-line reservist units. The Springfield 1903 was to be the standard issue rifle of America by the 19-teens. Of course, as you know, America stayed neutral during that war until 1917. It is worth noting that there's a lot of talk about the court case between Mauser and Springfield Arsenal, the U.S. government, about how they copied the Mauser design whole cloth. This is true. To put it in a nutshell, they won and the U.S. paid royalties, no problems there. But another conflict arose later over the Spitzer cartridge that this fired, the 30-06 round, because again, Mauser had kind of developed that. This is the one they basically said nuts to and didn't pay on. And of course, by then World War I was starting to go underway. So there were actually two different times that this rifle earned the attention of Mauser in Germany. Mauser DWM, those are the two patent holders in Germany. But yeah, the Springfield, Model 1903 and 30-06. Definitely an American classic. We'll move on. So the 1903 went into production at Springfield in 1904 and at Rock Island in 1905. These would be produced, and they were in pretty widespread service before World War I. Prior to that war, the U.S. had about 843,000, give or take, in service from both arsenals. Not an insignificant number, but not near the number that America would need for World War I. The war was unexpected, and we need millions of rifles, and we needed them immediately. Now, the Rock Island Arsenal had ceased production around 1914, so they started that production line back up. So there it is. We have Springfield. It's been making them more or less consistently since the beginning. Rock Island's back up and running in 1917. Still not enough rifles. So what America did, it turned to this weapon here. This is the U.S. Model 1917 rifle, often called the U.S. Enfield. Now we have a video dedicated to this gun. Check it out for the history of just how it came to be. But suffice it to say that in 1917, Remington, Winchester, and Eddystone had production lines to make these guns, well, something very similar, but in 303 for the British, called the P14, they had these production lines pretty much sitting idle because the British contract was over. They were there, and they thought, well, 303, 30-06, very similar. Let's just rework it to fire 30-06. Easily done. They were ready to go. The major difference was just that the 303 has a rim and the 30-06 does not. This is still based on the Mauser. Action. It holds 6 cartridges in the magazine instead of 5. We have a 26-inch barrel instead of 24. We take a slightly different style bayonet. We still have stacking rods, sling swivels. The biggest difference for a soldier would be this rear sight. This is an aperture sight, not as precise as the notch, but very much easier to use and faster to acquire. It's also faster to adjust compared to the Springfield, although we pretty much lack windage, elevation, and all that, at least on the fly. So we have better combat sights. We have 1 extra cartridge in the magazine. We have a production line ready to go. The only downside, we're a little bit longer and a little bit heavier. And probably the biggest downside, truthfully, it wasn't designed in America, even though it was produced here. It's a good thing we had this too, because in 1918, they discovered that an unknown number of Springfield rifles had improperly heat-treated receivers. So they halted 1903 production so they could figure out what happened. However, it's worth noting they did not pull these rifles out of the field. This was a problem at both Rock Island and Springfield. As it turns out, people were using visual means to see how hot receivers were getting for heat treating. They weren't using actual gauges. Obviously, visual checking is fine, but it's not great. You know, different lighting scenarios, different individuals, you really can't tell a receiver just based on how much it glows. So they instituted a new program, and they put them back into production. Now, at this point, about 1 million rifles had been made. Out of that 1 million, 58 had a receiver fail. Of those 58, 34 people received a minor injury, 9 people received a major injury, no one was killed, no one was permanently maimed, and quite a few happened in a laboratory setting as well, as they were trying to figure out what happened. So, 58 failures out of 1 million, not exactly a high proportion, but there was an issue, they addressed it, and that halted 1903 production for a time. which is really good. We had the 1917. This is why by the end of the war, about 1,300,000, 1,350,000 1903s had been produced by both Springfield and Rock Island. On the other hand, over 2,200,000 1917s have been produced by Eddystone, Winchester, and Remington. So, nearly a million more. Just in case you don't know, the serial ranges where these are considered pre versus post versus pre heat treat check. At Springfield, if you've got a rifle of a serial of over 800,000, you're fine. If you have a Rock Island with a serial over about 285,000, you're fine. But they did have an issue. Now, what's interesting about that, after World War I, Rock Island would quit making the 1903 again, but Springfield would continue till about 1926, 1927. The 1917, on the other hand, production would be halted just as soon as the war was over. On top of that, after the war, they put these two together to decide which would be standard issue. They had more of these, but the 1903 was supposedly the standard issue before the war. They decided to continue with the 1903 and to declare the 1917 obsolete. These were mothballed, kept in reserve for an emergency, and then later many were given away to U.S. allies immediately before and during World War II as Lend-Lease, which was really fun for the Brits because they had the P-14 and 303, and then they were given 1917s and 30-06, so they had to actually paint them to tell the difference. So as soon as World War I was over, even though the 1917 gave good service, it was pretty much tossed out because they didn't ever want it in the first place. It was an emergency substitute standard, a stopgap gun. The 1903 was really the one they wanted and loved. There was also the 1903 Mark I, introduced briefly in 1918. It was the same exact gun, except it had a cutout on the left receiver wall here that made it as an ejection port for the Pettersen device. Now the Pettersen device is interesting. Of course I don't have one, but it was basically a replacement bolt assembly that turned it into a semi-automatic carbine. Not too dissimilar to what would become the M1 carbine 20 some odd years later. So if you see a cutout on the side, you've got a 1903 Mark I. And not to say that the Pettersen devices, they made quite a few. They tried them out, they didn't like them, they took them all back, and they pretty much destroyed 99% of the ones out there. So today they're incredibly rare and cool, and there are some good videos out there on them. Forgotten Weapons has one, so check that out for more info, and I'm sure we'll toss up a picture too. But just one more variant. These served well in the trenches. It is a Mauser action, so it has all the pros of that. The U.S. was actually ahead of the curve in some ways by adopting a short rifle with a turn-down bolt handle, both things that make it more ergonomic and easy to maneuver for the soldiers, and they really don't sacrifice accuracy or anything, or range. Not much, not enough to care anyway. On the other hand, the sights are pretty meh. These are great sights for competition shooting, target shooting, but the front blade is incredibly thin, the rear sight is incredibly fine. They're not great for combat shooting. In that one sense, the 1917 definitely outshines the 1903. But both, since they're based on Mauser, are equally durable, reliable. This is a little bit lighter and a little bit shorter, holds one less round. You get the idea. But these were the two standard guns in World War I, and they worked well. I mean, between the two of them, they gave America about 3.5 million rifles to equip its soldiers with. And this would be the standard issue throughout the 1920s and beyond. We'll move on. So, after World War I. As I said, this soldiered on until 1926-27 in production at Springfield. After that, they would kind of close that down, although they would have over 1 million still in service. At the time, a couple of things happened. The U.S. military was starting to look towards getting a self-loading rifle. This began as early as 1924 to 1928, but wasn't really taken seriously. But it was serious enough that they discontinued '03 production. At the same time, they introduced the M1 ball cartridge, which was a boat tail intended to increase the range and performance. And while they continued prototyping various semi-auto self-loading guns, namely from Thompson, Pettersen, Garand, they introduced the 1903A1. This was basically the exact same gun, but with a more full pistol grip stock instead of a straight stock. They would also introduce the 1903A2, which was a sub-caliber targeting device for artillery, so basically turning in the rifle into an adjunct to an artillery piece for aiming. Again, there's a long story about how the Garand was adopted, and we'll visit that soon. But initially, they were going to not only adopt a self-loading rifle to replace the 1903, they were going to adopt a whole new cartridge to replace the 30-06, which, to be fair, was getting on in years a wee bit. They were going to go with a smaller diameter, higher velocity cartridge called the 276. And once the Garand was clearly going to be the new gun around 1932, it was recommended that it be adopted in this new caliber. However, the military, MacArthur among them, put a kibosh on this because they had so many millions and millions of rounds of 30-06 in reserve and stockpiles, so they wanted to have the new self-loading rifle chambered for the 30-06. So they went back, they reworked the Garand to fire it. By 1933, it was ready to go. The T1 became the M1. A few more testing and trials, ironing out of problems. 1936, it was officially adopted as America's first self-loading rifle for general issuance. And really, people claim it was the first in the world. This could be true for general issuance, but France and Russia had self-loading rifles in World War I, and during the same year, Russia adopted the AVS-36 with the intention of making it general issue as well. But either way, America was on the cutting edge, more or less. But this came with problems. They were having difficulties producing the M1 Garand. The early versions used the Bang, the gas trap system, like the Walther G41. Eventually they had to switch this to a short stroke or long stroke gas piston system. It took time. We'll do a video on the Garand, I'm sure, specifically. But the point is, in the late 30s, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and many in the military and even in the government were questioning if it was a smart idea. Also, in 1938, the M2 ball cartridge was introduced, which again kind of got away from the boat tail design and went back to more traditional. Well, 1939, Britain gets involved in World War II, and they reach out to Remington again, who had produced the P14 for them in World War I, and they would like Remington to make 1903s for them in 303. Remington starts to work on it. One of the things that the British want is a kind of a indention here, like on the 1917, the P14, to grip around. They also wanted to use their standard bayonet, so it takes Remington time to kind of rework the design. Now, where did they get the 1903 tooling? They obtained it from what was left over from the old Rock Island arsenal. Again, they had been out of production for over nearly 25 years at that point. So there's the tooling there. It was old, it was worn, but it was still usable, and they were going to use it. They also obtained quite a few stock blanks from the U.S. government. But so by the time they got all this set up in September of 1941, the British no longer needed the rifles. On the other hand, the U.S. military did. Again, the Garand, while by that point many of its issues are starting to get worked out, was still well behind schedule, so the U.S. military ordered about 135,000 1903s from Remington. They had the production line set up, they went for it. And obviously it was back to being in 30-06. They would deliver their first rifles in November of that year to the military, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and the military increased its order to 300,000 and then 500,000. They needed guns, they needed them fast, they couldn't make enough Garands fast enough at Springfield. They even brought Winchester in to make Garands. Still, they were running behind. This is why in the early days of World War II, 1942, you do see a lot of 1903s, and why there is a Remington 1903. However, they needed to speed up production, and the tooling from Rock Island was wearing out. So they had to get new tooling, and they needed to find shortcuts. This is where the 1903 modified comes from. It is a simplification, a streamlining of the 1903. It still uses the 03 rear sights, but it's using some stamped parts, it's using looser tolerances, it's using a newer Parkerized finish versus the old blued or kind of black finish, and just some other things. They let some slop get into the design so they could turn it out faster. And the 1903 modified as a transitional gun. It was first accepted in the early part of 1942. So the 1903 modified led into the gun I'm holding here. This is the 1903A3. This was first adopted by the military in May of 1942. And it's kind of the ultimate culmination of how they could simplify the 03 design. Probably the biggest difference in what finally made them go to a whole new designation is this rear sight. They finally got rid of that complicated and pretty needlessly complicated Springfield rear sight. They moved it further back, and they made it into a peep aperture, quite similar, at least in practice, to that of the 1917. As you can see, it just slides back and forth for adjustment, and we've got a wheel on the side to adjust for windage. So we have elevation and windage in a peep sight, and it's mounted further back on the receiver, which gives a longer sight radius, which is almost always a good thing. Now, the front sight is still that same skinny blade. This one has the sight protector on it. It just clips on. Kind of an interesting accessory. So those are the major differences as far as mechanics, but they did a lot of other things to make it faster, easier, cheaper to produce. For one thing, we went to stamped barrel bands. We went to a stamped front stacking swivel and front sling swivel here. You see they're flat. Since we got rid of the barrel mounted rear sight, now we have one just full length upper handguard that comes back further to keep the shooter's hand protected from the barrel. Moving back, most of these I've seen, if not all, still have kind of the round rear swivel. I'm not sure. I'm sure some maybe have this stamped out there, but most I've seen have that. But we do have a stamped and checkered butt plate. And those are the first rounds of simplifications introduced to the 1903A3. A short time later in 1942, they would introduce this new lower piece here, which is pretty much one stamped unit without a removable base plate, trigger guard stamped, a couple of screws to hold it in. Another thing they would do is they would eliminate the gas relief hole next to the chamber here. And then they would also remove the lightning cuts under the sight base here. Finally, they would go to a 2-groove rifle barrel around October of 1942. That was pretty much the ultimate culmination of how they could simplify this gun. They did tests and discovered that they could get away with it. Interestingly, they did not get rid of the magazine feed cutoff here, which, to be fair, also doubles as the bolt release. Now, if you notice, this stock has this semi-pistol grip. Originally, the military wanted Remington to make 1903A1s with the full grip stock like this Garand here. But they were also using a lot of leftover blanks that were given to them, which were straight stocks. So they came up with a compromise. They were able to modify straight stocks into what's called here a scant stock. They were able to make the cutout to give a semi-pistol grip. And this is kind of a holdover from the whole British thing. Kind of interesting how the British originally wanted something similar to the Enfield, but they had to work with the stock blanks they had. So this is what they came up with. Now, it's worth pointing out that while this came into service in May, and these started to be in the field as early as December of 42, the original 1903 modifieds did not completely disappear from production until around May, March, somewhere in that area, earlier spring of 1943. I'm sure this is because they were using up older receivers and parts and things, and they were just, building what they had. Remington, while they could produce quite a few of these, especially once the 03A3 came into being, couldn't make enough. So in 1942 as well, Smith Corona was contracted to make 03A3s to supplement the Remington production. So now we have 2 factories building these. This gun was never considered really frontline. It was substitute standard. The M1 Garand was the standard infantry rifle. But these were given to troops in the Pacific more than in Europe, just because of the priorities of the military placed on procurement. Also, the environments in the Pacific were sometimes required having a bolt action over an automatic just because of all the volcanic ash, dust, sand, water, all that. And they were used a lot here in the USA for home guard type things, and many were given to American allies under Lend-Lease. But definitely the 03 modified and the 03A3 saw combat in World War II. This was also the basis for the 1903A4 sniper rifle. So they were made as well. Production would be pretty high, but pretty brief. By March of 1944, the 03A3 would go out of production at both Remington and Smith Corona. By that point, they had enough Garands, the war was in favor of the Allies, so on and so forth. The story we know. Remington would make about 350,000 1903 modifieds, and a little over 700,000 1903A3s. Smith Corona would make about 235,000 1903A3s. Springfield would not produce this rifle during World War II. However, a lot of older Springfields would be refurbished in World War II and sent back out into the field. That's actually how my rifle here is. It's an original World War I receiver, but the barrel, it was rebarreled for World War II. Because these didn't have chrome line barrels, because 30-06 was corrosive, and because a lot of them were used in pretty damp environments in both World War I and World War II, the barrels did wear out pretty quick. Mechanically, there's really no difference between the 03 and the 03A3. Again, the 03A3 just has looser tolerances, and they would go to a newer style parkerized finish versus the original blued or kind of black oxide type finish used in World War I. The original Remington 1903s would be very similar to a later production Rock Island for obvious reasons. But of course with the 03A3 they kind of came up with their own design, which is unique. I actually like the 03A3 more. I think it's a more practical gun, and I don't know, the stamp swivels are neat to me. I've had this gun for a long time. I purchased it in the early 2000s from a shop down in Fort Smith, 2002 maybe? Hard to remember, but I've had it for a long time. This one I picked up about 12 years ago at a different shop down in Fort Smith. The bore on this 03 is so-so. It still shoots straight, but it's kind of dingy. But for the money they were asking, and what I liked about it, it is pretty much all correct 03 parts. You'll see a lot of these guns as they were refurbished. They would get a mix of 03 and 03A3 parts. And I tried to have two guns that pretty much are good examples of the complete series or class they did. But yeah, by 1944, the M1 Garand had proven itself. The early bugs had been worked out, and it was reigning king in World War II, and it would remain in service for a full decade, and then some after the war. The 1903, pretty much after World War II, was out of service. A few were still around for Korea. The 03A4 was still around through about Vietnam. But really, World War II was its last major use in combat. By that point, the automatic type guns were taking over. But these are both definitely American classics. People love them. It's a good gun, but it really is just a copy of a Mauser for all intents and purposes. And the few elements that aren't copied from the Mauser are actually copied from the Kreg, which is a Norwegian design. So while it is American, it actually, most of its elements came from foreign designs. But it is what it is. I mean, with so many made over such a long period of time, and with 4 factories making them, it's something that most people identify with. And a lot of these were sold off by the forerunner of the CMP, the DCM, back in the 50s and 60s, and they still had some as early, as late as 2000, give or take. So quite a few of these were sold through the civilian marksmanship program to Americans, and who've been using them in competition. The 03 is a very favored gun for customization and sporterization, which is pretty annoying for historical collectors like myself, but so it goes. That's what happens to popular guns. But yeah, we thought we would just talk about this thing. It's something we haven't done before at all. Kind of round out American collections. I'm in no way an expert on the 03. There are guys out there who live and breathe these, so for more information, I'm sure you can find their sources and their articles. But we just wanted to talk about this today. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. If you like the video, please click like. If you haven't subscribed, we really appreciate it if you do that as well. And this is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.